Welcome back to the podcast. You are listening to Launch Speed. I'm your host, Brendan, joined by my co-host, Zach. Today we have an interview with Dave Jackson from School of Podcasting. Make sure to check him out, and hope you guys enjoy.
There's multiple shapes and sizes. There's a side that a real fat guy is just a bear, and it's hitting an animal.
No, it's not going to hit a bear.
Well, yeah, I know that. But it will determine the
Launch speed?
Stop! I'm trying to think. I'm trying to put my words together. You're rushing me.
Am I helping?
No, not at all. No one else can see my hands.
Welcome to Launch Speed.
So Dave, can you give us a little background on you and where you've come from at the beginning? Like, what was your podcast like in the beginning?
Sure. I started back in 2005, and just a little bit before podcasting, I've been teaching. I taught in the corporate world for about 20 years. I taught a lot of Microsoft Office and QuickBooks and things like that. So I was kind of a geek. And in 2005, I heard about podcasting. I Googled it, and there was a page and a half of results. So I actually thought I'd broken the internet. I'm like, wow, that's weird. There's nothing about this. And at the time, I was doing a newsletter for musicians. And so I just took that same content and put it out as a podcast. And then as more and more people kind of like, hey, what's a podcast? Which went on for about 3 years. Actually, it's still kind of going on. But anyway, I I was between jobs, as they say. And so it's hilarious because the reason I started a podcast was the biggest reason I tell people not to start a podcast, which is to make money quickly. I was like, look, I need money to keep me in car, phone, and insurance. And so I started the School of Podcasting to teach people how to podcast. And,
Well, I guess at the time you were starting, there wasn't a whole lot of other people podcasting.
No,
I heard about. Go ahead.
Just at the time, I was probably one of the first 100, if not less than that.
Wow.
Which was fun because I'm trying to teach people how to podcast and nobody's heard of them. So the first thing I would hear was, I would like, well, have you ever thought of a podcast? And they go, well, I don't have an iPod. And I'm like, you don't need an iPod. You just need a microphone and the internet. And they're like, okay, so, and just nobody got it. It took a very long time for it to catch on.
Yeah, I first heard about podcasts in, I think it was 2005 from my cousin. And I also thought that it was an Apple only thing because of pod being in the title.
Sure.
And then I didn't really hear much about podcasts until a couple of years ago. And I feel like it's kind of blown up in the last couple of years.
Yeah, it's actually grown every year since 2005. What comes and goes is the media attention. So you can go back to like 2007 and it'll be like podcasting is dead. And then in 2008, it's like, it's the resurgence of podcasting. And then 2009, podcasting is dead. It's like, that's all it does. And so when Serial came out a couple of years ago, that was a huge thing because there was a parody made on Saturday Night Live, and just more and more people. The latest Edison research now says that 70% of people have actually heard the phrase podcast, because for a while people were like, what? And then now we're up to 51% of Americans, at least, have at least listened to one podcast. So that was kind of a big deal that we're now the majority. We're at 51% of people have at least heard one. Now it keeps going up. This year, we had probably one of our biggest jumps from people that listen to on a weekly basis, but that's from Edison research. So just, if you look at that, you'll see where it's just every year it's gone up, but it's been like 2 and 3% every year. And I think this year it was something like 6 or 7, which was pretty cool.
Do you remember the stat on the percentage of the US that listens to them weekly?
It is, it's funny you say that. I've been behind the scenes going, I need my Edison research stuff. And this
I did read these stats. So I want to say it's somewhere around like 13%, but I don't want to be wrong.
Yeah, it's kind of like in a way depressing because you'll see where X amount of people listen, monthly, and then as it goes to weekly and so forth, it just keeps getting lower and lower. I cannot find here. I'll actually just go to their website. But it does go up every year, and even though it's less than the number of people that have heard it and things of that nature, that number also has gone up every single year. So it's just a matter of, and like the biggest reason some people go, well, I don't know, why would I listen to a podcast? And you're like, because there's all sorts of cool stuff. There's one of the most, I guess we would call it nichiest shows that I've ever heard of is called the chameleon breeder. And I'm like, do you mean like you breed chameleons? And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, that's it. You win. I don't think anybody's going to get more like it's a what podcast? And he makes actual cages for chameleons. And it was interesting. I had him on my show and he said that his audience said, well, we will buy your cages, even though they're actually technically more expensive than the ones we can buy from China. We want to buy yours because you're part of our community. You give us value every week. And so it was funny because he said, yeah, I have to slow down my podcast because my manufacturer can't keep up. And I go, no, my friend, you get a new manufacturer and you double down on the podcast. You don't, it's like it's starting to work. Don't pump the brakes just yet. So yeah, it's interesting. So I mean, I know there are shows about people that are just adopted. There's one living with herpes that's a podcast because if you think about it, that's not really something you can talk about with Uncle Earl. You're like, hey, Uncle Earl, I got the clap. What do I do? But you can talk to other people that do. So, and they have, as she put it, I interviewed her on my show, and she said, look, I have like a double secret probation kind of Facebook group that we just don't let anybody in. But yeah, the monthly listening is up to 32%. That's 90 million. And the weekly listening is 22%, which is 62 million. And that's still, because on one hand, you go, oh, 22 up from 17. So that's a 5% jump.
Yeah.
And you think about 22, I'm like, yeah, that's 62 million people. So that's a lot of people listening to it. But it really is a case of what I did the one day, I just went to Facebook. I kind of have two Facebooks, one for all my podcasting stuff and one for my family. And I said, name a hobby that you have. And somebody said, like, I play the banjo. And I like went to Google, typed in, banjo podcast. Here you go. Go listen to this. So there's a podcast for everybody.
Yeah, that's one of the crazy things about podcasting that I'd never heard of something as, what was the word you used? Nichiest?
Niche. Well, they always say, there's broadcasting and then there's like, you have a niche. So as opposed to being, I don't know, men's health, you go, I'm going to go deeper. I'm going to go, triathletes. Or instead of football, which could be college or NFL, I'm going to go NFL. And instead of just NFL, I'm going to go whatever, Northeast division. I'm not much of a football person. Instead of not Northeast, I'm going to go, Cleveland Browns. So it's the deeper you get, the smaller the audience, but the deeper the relationship you have with people. I had a client of mine, her son had autism and she loved Disney, and she made a podcast called Special Mouse, and it was all about how to take people with special needs to amusement parks. And she never had a huge amount of downloads, but the people that found that were like, oh my gosh, I thought I was the only person going through this. And so she had this super tight knit Facebook group of people that were all just sharing information and tips and tricks and things like that. So that's what I mean when I say niche. It's not like broadcasting where today we're going to talk about money and business and, like a newspaper. It's hyper focused on a topic.
Right. And I'd say that chameleon breeder is pretty much the epitome of that.
That's it. It's every time somebody goes, oh, I know a niche podcast. I go, I guess I'm pretty sure I can beat you. And they'll say something like, well, I have one. It's for, this minor league baseball team. I'm like, nope, I can still beat it. Chameleon breeder. And they're like, yeah, you win.
Yeah. Yeah. That's like that's trump card. You
Yeah,
can't really beat that.
No.
So do you think that it's because of media attention that's gotten podcasting so popular recently, or would you say that it's because of these niche podcasts that people can access communities with similar ideas and similar experiences?
It's a little bit of both. You have these companies that make phenomenal podcasts, and you have the NPRs of the world, and NPR promotes their podcast on their radio stations, which is great because that brings people into the space. And then you have, Chris Hardwick, you have Joe Rogan, you have, all these, Dave Ramsey, Joyce Meyer, all these people that are on TV, all these celebrities have a podcast, and they will say on their radio shows, if you missed this today, go over to my website and sign up for my podcast. So you have more and more people driving traffic. And then you get into things like This American Life and Serial that were kind of a big deal. And those people came over for one podcast, but said, oh, wait, there are other kinds of things over here too. And so they start searching around, and that's where it starts to trickle down to, oh, wait a minute. You mean there's a podcast here on, insert weird topic here. And they go, wow, that's cool. Like I was teaching a kind of a workshop at a local college for small business people. And I asked, I said, has anybody here never listened to a podcast? And they're like, 5 hands went up. I'm like, this is awesome. And the woman had an iPhone. I showed her how to pull up the Apple Podcast app. And I go, do you have any hobbies, or like, what's your favorite TV show? And she just typed in Hallmark Channel. And apparently there is a Hallmark Channel podcast. And again, I say there's a podcast for everything. So, and it's just, you just show them, like, here, click there, hit play. There you go. And that's when they kind of look and they go, well, how much does this cost? And you're like, it's free. So it's a lot of fun that way. So I think it's a combination of both. And then the thing that really 40% of people find podcast by somebody telling them, wait till you hear this show. And I know a lot of people love to freak out over Apple charts and things like that. That's about 10% of people finding podcasts, but like about 70%. There's two different kinds of words. Is it word or word of mouth, I guess, in a Jacob study. So you have a lot of people telling their friends, you've got to hear this podcast. And a lot of the times that's how I find mine, or I hear them on another podcast. And so it's just a matter of telling people, what do you mean subscribe? Because a lot of people are like, what do I have to pay money for that? Because everything else I subscribe to, Netflix and Hulu and my cable bill, that's a fee. And you're like, no, it's free. So once they get it, and that's the fun part, every year we see where it used to be the average was about 4 podcast episodes a week, and that's now up to 7, because once you find podcasts, you quit listening to radio because it's horrendous, and then you just start listening to more and more.
Yeah, I would agree that radio is terrible. I used to listen to audiobooks on my commutes, and it got kind of dry and boring, and I found podcasts, and I've never gone back.
Yeah, I listened. There was a sports guy here, afternoons, number one drive time guy. And I started listening to his podcast. And that's when I noticed that his first hour was 38 minutes. And I'm like, wait, and then it dawned on me, the other 22 minutes are commercials. And I was like, that's why I don't listen to radio anymore. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's like every time you turn it on, it's a commercial. And I think, as they lose listeners to podcasts and things of that nature, they feel the need to put in more commercials.
And they're starting to freak out because they're losing their audience. So we're going to put in more so we can charge more and make more. Yeah, it's sad. And meanwhile, podcasting has already overtaken satellite radio in the car. So every year, radio goes down a little bit. It's going to take a long time to dethrone radio. But at this point, they're declining and we're increasing. So somewhere, I don't know how many years, but it will take a little bit. But eventually, we'll overtake radio in the car.
Yeah. And I think that'll probably be not too far away. But I mean, so like as a consumer, it's undeniably a good thing that there's so many podcasts out there. But as a podcaster, it seems like there's more competition than ever.
Well, there's at this point about 700,000 podcasts in Apple Podcasts. The good news is anybody can make a podcast. The bad news is anybody can make a podcast. And there's a service called Anchor .fm that is basically, they should be fined for littering, because a lot of people go over. It's free. It's super easy. You just talk into your phone, and they say you're going to make money, but they don't tell you that it's 0.0002 cents a download. And oh, by the way, we control your show on Apple and all sorts of other fun stuff. So people will go over and they'll start a podcast. They'll do 2 episodes and go, never mind. Well, under normal circumstances, if you leave your media host, they will then your files go dead, and Apple will remove your stuff from their directory. Well, now you're using a free media host, so when you quit, they don't care. You're not going to not pay them anymore. It's kind of weird. So, yeah, the thing about competition. I always say that is different than radio. If we were both on at 7:30 in the morning, that would be competition. Some of my best friends are my quote competition. I actually do a show with my competition, and that's because you can listen to Ray Ortega at the Podcasters Roundtable on Monday. You can listen to me on Tuesday. You can listen to Daniel J. Lewis from the Audacity to Podcast on Wednesday. You can listen to Eric K. Johnson on Thursday. So I don't really see it as competition. Granted, there's only so many hours in a day that people can listen to podcasts, but at this point, I don't take that kind of radio mentality of we must smash the competition and kill them. And it's like, nah, but there's a lot out there. But I also think there's a lot of bad stuff out there. And I believe that the cream is going to rise to the top. And the other thing is, I had somebody once say, well, there's so many good podcasts out there that, I'm just not going to start one. I'm like, that's kind of like saying, okay, Tom Brady is the best quarterback in football. I guess I'm not going to start playing football. Well, eventually he's going to retire. And it's the same thing with podcasts. Eventually these people are going to go, okay, I'm done and quit. So I think of podcasting a lot like books. Every year people still write books, but there's a book on every single subject. And you could say, well, think every year we get another 30, 40 books on weight loss. We have more than enough books on weight loss. So it's just a matter of, if you can try to do something to make yourself stand out, but that's where the fun part comes in, because people start a podcast and they want to, quit their day job in 6 weeks, and that's just not a reality.
For somebody who doesn't watch a lot of football, you sure do use a lot of football analogies.
I do. Well, I live in Cleveland, so or near Cleveland, I should say. And so for the past 7 years, we have had almost no team to watch, and now we actually have players that I might actually, take some time to watch. We'll have to see.
You got to get Baker on your show.
That's it.
That'd be a huge step. I wanted to go off of something that you mentioned about getting the cream rising to the top. How did you develop your own your voice and your podcast to stand out, to rise to the top?
Part of it is I have to know who my audience is. And so for me, it's kind of weird. I started off thinking it was going to be kind of 30, 35-year-old entrepreneurs that are out of college and they're ready to start out, and maybe they have, a day job and they want a super duper side hustle. And it really, as I look at it, the majority of the people are actually kind of baby boomers with an empty nest. Like all their kids have gone to college or they're married or whatever. And it's Marge and Homer. And they're like, all right, well, now what do we do? The kids are gone. And they're like, hey, I've got some life experience. I've got something to say. I've got a message. I've got a passion. I'm going to start a podcast. But there are also those people that are like, I don't know, technology kind of frightens me. So that's where I come in to go, really, the water's fine. Come on in. Let me show you how this works. So that's one of my audience. And then the other thing is I go where they are. Like I was just in Vegas at the National Association of Broadcasters. I go to Podfest. I go to Podcast Movement, but I also go to author events because those people need publicity. I go to copywriting events because those people are trying to get more traffic to their website. All these people that are trying to get traffic or things like that, they could benefit from a podcast. So it's a matter of going where your audience is. And then this is the step that everybody wants to skip: make friends with them and bring value to the conversation, because the next step is tell them about your podcast. Well, if you skip make friends and bring value and you just walk in, they just think you're a giant spammer. I remember when I first was getting into podcasting, I found, and this tells you how long ago it was, this is before Facebook, and there were these things called forums. And I walked in on this forum and it was from ex-DJs. So people who were on the radio and now they're not. I'm like, oh, this is a gold mine. These people already know about microphones and how to, this is going to be great. And I just walked in. I'm like, hey, I'm Dave Jackson from the School of Podcasting. Everyone should start a podcast. Follow me. Let's go. Yay. And they banned me in like 20 minutes. It's like, okay, get this, whoever this person is, get him out of here. So you have to make friends with people first, then tell them about your podcast. And
that
plus,
while you're,
that's it.
I mean, like Reddit, for example, Reddit could be a great place to promote your podcast, but they shame self-promotion, and you're very likely to get banned from every subreddit for putting your podcast in there.
Yeah, Reddit's a great place to figure out what your audience wants to hear. So if I'm doing a podcast about, I don't know, fatherhood, I could go to a Facebook group, I could go to a Reddit forum and see what's going on in the dad forums and see what their biggest complaints are, what their biggest pains are, things like that. And then if I can solve a problem for them, then okay, now they're like, well, this person seems to know what they're talking about. Well, what is this podcast thing you speak of? So, and you can do things without self-promotion. You could say, oh, I did an episode about this on my podcast. No link, no nothing, just lets people know I have a podcast. And then they can go, wait a minute, and click on your name and go over and do some investigation, again, but that is hinged on you delivering value in what you say.
Yeah, that's a sly way to do it, but yeah. Yeah. I mean, social media promotion is, I would say, tough.
Yeah, it is.
It's tough to kind of add value and not seem just like you're shamelessly self-promoting yourself.
Yeah, it's kind of funny where different Facebook groups, and it's funny because like my favorite is like, hey, why don't we all share, where we came from or what our podcast is about? Well, that's just self promotion. It's like, oh, but I didn't do it. I was just wondering what people were. And then it's this giant post of 800 people putting their links and stuff. And I'm like, okay, we kind of knew. It's almost like two people get together and like, I want to promote my show. Can you please go make a post and asking me to post my show? And it just after a while, I just want to go, really? Because that's what I call spray and pray. If I just go into a Facebook group and, hey, I do this show. Well, okay, that's not really your target audience. Like if I do a show about weight loss, but I'm in a podcast group, on Facebook, well, that group's supposed to be talking about microphones and all sorts of other stuff. And I walk in and go, yeah, I do a weight loss show. They're like, what? Who? I want to know what's the best microphone. So it's spray and pray. You're like, well, one of those people might need to lose weight. I'm like, go, go over to the weight loss podcast and see what they're talking about. And then make really good content that's so good that the people that listen to it are going to tell their friends, and then make sure it's super easy to share on your website.
Yeah, that was my next question. I mean, I know they say content is king, but let's pick our podcast for an example. We're kind of in the tech news, gaming, and just general current events category.
Mhm.
So we're not so niche. We're kind of flooded. So besides having really good content, how would you stand out?
You can be somewhat controversial. I have a friend of mine that does a marketing show called Red Podcast. His name's David Hooper. And instead of just, hey, let's talk return on investment and Facebook ads and, whatever, he interviewed an escort, I guess we shall call her. She was an escort because how do you market your business when your business is illegal? Those people that call you and they say they're from the IRS, but they want to get paid in iTunes gift cards, those people. He actually called them back, and it took him a while, but he got to actually have a conversation. Turn out some 18-year-old kid in Iran who just wanted a motorcycle. He's just trying to make a buck. But he explained how, and he picks things apart. Like, okay, they're trying to inspire you to buy stuff here through fear or through, it's just there's always a lesson there, but it's something that you go, well, this is not my grandpa's marketing show. So that's one of them. And I guess part of it is always be yourself. I hear people that, they want to talk like this because they think they're on the radio. And I'm like, no, we started podcasting because, people fell in love with podcasting because they didn't talk like this. Traffic and weather on the 10s, everybody. It was normal people. So other than that, it's just a matter of getting your audience involved. So that is really the kindling, your audience. And the big shows that have, hundreds of thousands of downloads, they can't answer every email. So if you get an email, reply back to that person and then ask them a question and get that conversation going. And it's kind of weird because, and I know, and that I know that we're just like, we put our pants on one at a time, but because we're behind the microphone, when we reply to that person, they're like, oh my gosh, like Brendan, actually, like I got an email from Brendan. I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe this. And then what do? They tell somebody. If you can, I have a voicemail number. I use podcastvoicemail.com. I tell people to call that. I make sure that the phone number is in the show notes because depending on which phone you're using, sometimes you can click that and actually call it right there. And then I'm sure to put that in the voicemail. If you call it, it says, hey, if you leave a message and you don't want it on the show, be sure to say, I don't want this on the show, because otherwise it's going on the show. And it's just anything you can do to get the conversation going. And then because the more you have the conversation, the more you learn what your audience wants, the more you learn what your audience wants, the better the content you make. And then it's just a matter of, lather, rinse, repeat. But I've been searching for 14 years for the giant golden switch that gives you 10,000 downloads. And that's just not something that's available. You just got to grind it out.
Yeah. So you're talking about interacting with our audience. The thing is, our audience that we've noticed, it's mostly been our friend group, which we're having problems getting outside of our friend group because our friends all talk to each other. So they only recommend, the only people that are getting recommendations for our show are our friends. And also, how people in their 20s don't really want to email and have a conversation over email. They want to Snapchat or use Twitter. Should we go on to Twitter and Snapchat to interact with these people?
And that's the key that you just said something very key. Go where your audience is, right? I'm an old middle-aged white guy, so I'm going to do my email thing. But if your audience is in Snapchat and Twitter, then go where your audience is. So yeah, that's a key ingredient there. Yeah, and get that conversation going. You could use a tool like slicktext.com, and you could actually have people text a code, and it would then send them a link to subscribe to your show. So there's all sorts of tools you can use to do that. I know I'm trying to pull mine up as we speak, except I'm typing the wrong thing. If you text text SOP, which is short for School of Podcasting, if you text SOP to 31996, Select Text sends you a thing that says, hey, thanks so much for texting. Here's a link to subscribe to the show in Apple. Here's a link to subscribe to the show on Android. So it's a matter of knowing your audience and then communicating how they want.
I appreciate that. And also the other part of our question was, how do we get out of our friend group? How do we reach people that we don't have regular interactions with?
Okay, you can go to sites like meetup.com. You can go into now. Here's when I say a Facebook group. Are you guys like, ugh, what a grandpa Facebook?
No, we're not bashing on middle-aged men right now. I mean, we'll do that. We'll do that later on our episode.
Excellent. Okay. But if there's some place you can go where your audience is, and just find out what they're talking about, and they say, oh yeah, and you can just drop subtle hints like I talked about this on my podcast. And then give them a nugget of value. And then if they want more, they'll say, well, wait, where's your podcast at? So, but it's a matter of figuring where your audience is and go there. So if there are any events for, like, if there's, if you're talking about gaming and a big game is coming out, it's, Halo 6 or whatever the next one is, go to the latest GameStop and have business cards made that say, hey, if you like gaming, check out this show. And then on the back, have your website. On your website, have it super easy to subscribe to your show, because the last thing you want to do is say, oh, find me an Apple Podcast along with the other 700,000 podcasts. You want to have subscribe buttons on your website, because if this was a car radio, back when we used to listen to the radio in the car, you could scan the dial because you drove someplace on vacation and all your favorite stations are gone. Well, when you find one, you hit the preset button. You're like, oh, cool, finally a rock station. Let's put that in preset 1. Oh, cool, another rock station. Okay, preset 2. Well, that's what Apple is doing. They give you a link right to your show. That's your preset. That's what Google does. That's what Spotify does. And so put those links on your website, drive people to your website. Now they don't have to search in those apps, because even Spotify now their search is not great. So now you're sending them to your website. They can click on that link and go directly to your show and subscribe right there. And if you're doing any kind of Facebook marketing, you can put the Facebook pixel on your website, and now everywhere they go, they're going to see another link for your podcast.
Oh, because what we did was we wanted extra security, so we make them enter their social security number before they subscribe.
Excellent. That's even better.
Yeah,
that'll have people just dying to subscribe.
Yeah, I think it's important, I guess, especially to focus on Apple, because I think something like 70% of podcasts are listened to through the Apple Podcast app.
Yeah, between 60 and 70%. But don't forget, if your show has kind of a global reach, 80% of Europe is on Android. And a lot of people forget that. And I'm like, oh man, you could grow your audience easily, especially if you're talking something that's, gaming's kind of a global thing. And when you give somebody an Apple link on an Android phone, it's like, okay, what am I supposed to do with this? Now, right now, as we speak, Apple is actually making new web pages for your show that will work on a Android phone, which is kind of cool. So Apple's trying to make it a little more universal, because for the longest time, if you just gave somebody an Apple link on an Android, they're like, yeah, this sends me right into the brick wall. So yeah, so I always try to have both Apple and that's why I send them back to my website. Because on my website, I've got links to whatever you need, as opposed to, oh, here's an Apple link. I hope you have an Apple phone. Because 20%, if you look at that, we were talking, 62 million? So 10% is 6 million. 20% is 12 million people are going, oh, yeah, I don't have anything to do with that link. Thanks. So I always send them to my website where they can do whatever they want.
Right, yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. The thing you just mentioned about Apple making a podcast website or making podcasts available online, that's extremely recent news, I think, within the last couple days.
No, they've had this old clunky version, and it's, you would go to it. I always just called it the Apple listing, and it only updated about every 24 hours, which is not going to change. It's still kind of a snapshot of your show. But this one's a little more, I guess, user friendly. And there's a button there still to send you to either iTunes if you're on like a desktop computer, or the Apple Podcast app. And it's just the fact that we're kind of excited that, wow, those actually work on something that's not an Apple device. So that's kind of cool.
And talking about sharing it and using and reaching your audience and going to your audience, we have our own social medias, and we also have social media set up for our podcast alone. And what I've noticed personally as a consumer of podcasts is I like getting notifications from the podcast, and I don't particularly appreciate when I also follow all the hosts and they're sharing stuff as well. I feel like my timeline's just filled with their podcast news. Should we stick to just using our podcast to promote it, or should we also use our own at first?
That's a great question. I kind of do a little of both. I try not to just promote because, on one hand, people will see that. It's funny, they won't listen on Twitter, but the fact that they see that there's a new episode, okay, then they'll go to their app and listen to it. So it's kind of a notification type thing. But I always try, I go back to, again, delivering value. So I might say, oh, here's a cool article that I just found, or I'll try to come up with something funny to say, or, a news article, something that's not always about me, because otherwise there's no information. It's just, promote. And after a while you're like, yeah, okay, I get it.
It's not very engaging.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's another thing too. So every now and then I'll just throw out a question, like, hey, what do you guys think about such and such? And then you just have to make sure to go back and, watch your replies and that whole 9 yards, because there's nothing worse you can do than ask for, interaction. You get it, and then you ignore it. They're like, well, that's the last time I replied to that.
Right. How often do you do these kinds of posts? Like, I guess the non-promoting posts on social media offering some sort of insight or advice. Is that like daily or weekly?
I will raise my hand right now and say I am horrible, especially at Twitter. I actually finally went in and turned off all my automation because I realized that my Twitter was horrendous. It was just, like once a day you'd get a link to a back catalog, something that was going on. And so I finally turned that off. But I usually start off the day. I have a bunch of tools I use to kind of see what's going on in the news with podcasting or et cetera, and find something that, like, oh, I bet my audience would love this. And I'll throw it in Facebook, I'll throw it in Twitter, and then kind of go from there and see what's going on. Because for the longest time, I just ran out of time. And when you have your Twitter automated to where these posts are going out, it just became the Dave show 24/7. And I'm like, let's do something a little more interactive. So I'm slowly getting my act back together on that. But if it was me, I would do, I don't know, once a week, throw out a question, and then, or polls, or all sorts of fun Twitter polls. And then you can talk about that on your podcast. Hey, I did a Twitter poll. If you want to follow me, here I am at such and such. And then that way it's a way just to get people following you. And if that's where your audience is, by all means, yeah, start doing that, start doing polls. Talk about it on your show, and then people want to be involved with that. I mean, Jimmy Fallon on the Tonight Show does that all the time. He does hashtags every Thursday. He sends out a hashtag and asks for a story. So that's something you could just politely borrow and tweak a bit to make it your own topic.
Yeah, and that makes I really like the idea of polls. I can't believe we hadn't thought about that before. And just out of curiosity, you mentioned you had tools for, I guess, finding news. Are those more than just RSS aggregators?
That's it. I use one called I think it's In-Out Reader or INO Reader. I'm trying to pull it up, but yeah, inoreader.com. And what I like about it is you can go in and say, okay, watch this RSS feed, but filter it for these words, and don't show it, show me Lewis, not Jerry kind of things, so that it's really trying to put decent information in front of you.
Right. That's what I use, but I mean, there's just so much, tech and gaming news that are out there. So it's kind of overwhelming, and sorting through it is just.
Wait, you've been using this?
Yeah,
this whole time?
Yeah,
dude, I thought you've just been a monster at finding articles. I'm so mad.
Similar.
I've been Google searching everything.
I guess I should have shared this with you,
dude. What is? Sorry, Dave. We're having some.
That's all right. Some internal meltdown. No, there's Google Alerts. That's another one you can use. And then I'm subscribed to a couple industry kind of, pod, like there's one's podnews.net by James Cridlin, which is really cool because he's on the other side of the planet. So you get a completely wider view of what's going on in podcasting from James. And there's, I think, Pod to Pod, there's Hot Pod, but Hot Pod is by a guy whose name is escaping me right now, Nick Qua. And he just talks about podcasting in New York. So he's talking a lot about the Gimlet and all the big, Uber networks and things like that, which is at times a little disheartening because people think he's talking about the podcasting industry. And it's like, nope, asterisks in New York. So there were 1,000 people at Podfest this year, and he didn't even mention it. Why? Because it wasn't in New York and it wasn't, big companies. So he's got his own little niche. But I still read it just because every now and then you'll find out that some big company in New York is making a move, and okay, I want to see if that's going to affect, independent podcasters.
So I kind of want to move into our podcast specifically, stuff that we could do. We've been having a problem with transitions, trying to make them not sound scripted or drawn out.
Mm-hmm.
How do you transition between subjects in the podcast?
The one is to not I always love when people go, do you want to go to the lightning round? I don't know. You want to go to the lightning round? Yeah. Okay. Let's go to the lightning round. Just go to the lightning round. Just hit the music, whatever it is. It's, here I have a buzzer, okay. And now it's time for the lightning round, just whatever it is, hit the lightning bolt and go. So that's it. Typically when I start an episode, I know what I'm going to talk about. And I will look at him like, okay, this is my top story. So I'm not going to put it at the end of the show because the news doesn't do that. Our top story tonight, a 5-alarm fire on Main Street. But first, let's talk about this cat video. No, they get to the top story. That's why it's called the top story. There's a reason why there's a skip intro button on Netflix. There's a reason there's a 32X on Hulu. People want to get to the content. So I start off, okay, what's my top story? Let's do that. And then I could transition into this. And sometimes it just doesn't fit. And sometimes I'll go, you know what? That doesn't fit, but I'm going to be talking about this in a week or two. Is this time sensitive? No. Okay. Let's put this with this other episode. And so I use Evernote to keep track of all my thoughts because half the time the best podcasting ideas are in the shower. So I used to have my phone when I get out of the shower and I'll start putting stuff in Evernote or things like that. But, I use transition music. I just grab music it's a matter of just talking. So let's say I'm going to transition into the next thing. I will say, okay, so here we are talking about the gaming industry and how to go into a transition. Fade the music in. The voice already says, we're done here. And then the next one is like, all right, I want to talk about such and such and such and such and blah, 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 blah. And then when you get to the end of the transition, you just start to talk like this. And in transition music, there you go. There's a show I listen to called The Newsworthy. It's really cool where the host comes on. It's like 9 minutes long. It just gives you the news on what you need to do. And she just talks about a story. She was like, hey, today Boeing did this and their planes are grounded and yada, yada, yada. And then she fades music up for a half a second. And then she comes back in. Today, President Trump did this, yada, 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 yada. Fades up a little music, gets it out. Hey, I want to talk to you about our sponsor. Fades the music back up. Okay, next story. And she does like 10 minutes and that's it. But it's just enough little music to break things apart so that you're like, wait, is this still the same story? President Trump is now flying a Boeing plane? No, you got to have something in there so you can kind of set it apart. So I use music. That's fine for me. I do hear people from time to time do the thing, though, where they have to announce, hey, it's time for, whatever. And I'm like, okay, I guess that's a transition. The beautiful thing about podcasting is it's your show and you can do it however you want. So how do you guys currently do it?
So currently we just kind of just say, let's move on to the next thing. And then we move on.
Or somebody will softball a stupid question to the other one and just, we'll hit a dribble to first.
I try and like find a good or terrible segue into the next topic. It doesn't always work, but this is what I try and do. We don't exactly have segments like you were describing.
Mm-hmm.
We do in our notes, but we just kind of free flow it during the podcast. Do you think that segments are better or is more of a free form conversation? And you said you can do it however you want, but I mean, would you say that one is necessarily more gooder?
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. The number one rule in podcasting, no matter how you do it, don't be boring. So whether that's segments or whatever, somebody asked me, there's a great book called Beyond Powerful Radio. And the author's name is Valerie Geller. She says, there is no such thing as too long, only too boring. And if you think about it, I mean, there's a guy named Dan Carlin. He does a show called Hardcore History. His podcasts do not come out on a regular basis, which is kind of a no-no. And then they're somewhere between 2 and 6 hours long. And when they come out, he gets millions of downloads. It's insane. Why? Because they're really, really good. And when people hear this, like, oh, you like history? You got to listen to Dan Carlin. So the thing I wouldn't do is say, let's move on. Or, and also if you can, have a Slack going or some sort of chat system going on so that you can communicate without actually saying, okay, are we done with this topic? Yeah, that's it. And if you know the bullet points that you're going to hit and you've got your, Google Doc open and you're both looking at it, I just heard you hit the last bullet point. I know we're done. And if I don't have anything to add to it, I can just say, and that's where you, sometimes it's like, it's hard to come up with, okay, hey, speaking of chocolate, did you see that car yesterday? And you're like, wait, what? that doesn't work. So that's the
transitions like that.
Yeah. And so that's where it gets kind of tough. But the beauty of it is if you really just like, oh, wow, I just, big turd right there. The beauty of editing. I edit all my shows. I am by far, you'll listen to this. I say a lot and I say, to the point of nauseous. And I just edit my stuff out so I sound brilliant. So that's the other key.
Perfect.
I mean, I always say Mount Rushmore was a bunch of rocks, and then somebody came along and edited it. So, there are book editors, there's newspaper editors, there's movie editors, but yet some people are like, no, I'm going to just keep it real. Oh, well, okay. I guess everything that comes out of your mouth is perfect, but a little editing can make you from good to great.
So what's better? Is it better to sound perfect, or is it better to sound maybe more personable? Like you kind of know the person, like you understand what they're saying is just stream of consciousness, not necessarily perfect.
Well, the thing I hate is reading. If somebody is reading their podcast to me, I don't like the way that it sounds, especially because in the middle, if they mess up, they go back to the beginning of the sentence. Ugh. If you're going to script your show, write the way you talk. Throw punctuation out the window and just write it down the way you talk. Then you'll have a chance of making it sound like that. I'm with you. I like bullet points. And then I talk to one person. I never say, hey, you guys, because I doubt that there's somebody sitting around, I don't know, some sort of JBL speaker. It's a Bluetooth and there's a group of people listening to it. No, I'm talking to one person. So I don't say, I want to thank everybody for tuning in. I go, I want to thank you for tuning in. And I talk to one person. And when I go and if I'm lucky enough to be at an event and somebody goes, hey, I listen to your show. And I'm like, thank you so much. What do you like about it? And I'm like, I don't know. I just feel like you're talking to me. And I go, it's because I am. And so it's just that, because I'm already literally in their ears. And if I can talk to one person, number one, it's not as frightening to me because I'm not thinking about the tens of people who are going to listen to my show. I'm talking to one person and I'm really excited. And then I've got my bullet points in front of me and I just go through it. And if I mess things up, here's a key. If you mess things up, just pause for 5 seconds because it's so easy to then spot your mistakes in your file. Because all of a sudden you've got all these squiggly lines and then you just have nothing. And you're like, there's where you messed up. So it makes it super easy to do that. So I try to have a conversation and I go for what I call low hanging fruit. So if I do something like that, that's so easy to cut out that But if I go, not really sure what I should do about that, now you got to get a scalpel to get that out of there. I'll leave that in there because people say people breathe. But anything that's annoying, or for me, when I go to ask a question, so I've got my list of questions if I'm doing an interview. And I ask the first one and I get the podcast going in the direction I want it to go. And then I put the pad aside and I listen. And what I'm listening for is, do I ask a follow-up question? Did they just give me something like, hey, sometimes it takes me 2 years to make a podcast episode. And I'm like, oh, I definitely got to ask a question about that. And those are the ones, because they're not written down, I'll say something like, so you said earlier that what are you doing for 2 years when you create an episode? I will cut out all that stammering because it's my mouth engaging before my brain has figured out what I want to say. And I do that all the time where I'm in the middle of a question and I think I'm going left. And then suddenly my brain goes, no, let's ask them this. And I'll go right. I'll cut out the whole first part. So half the time when I'm editing, I'm not editing my guest. I'm editing me being a moron talking before I figured out what I want to ask.
I mean, based on how you're talking to us, it seems like you don't really have much editing to do. I mean, you're so fluid and fluent. It's like you've been doing this for, I don't know, 14 years.
A little bit, yeah. And the funny part is, my first job when I was 16, I got fired because I was too shy. I wouldn't talk to anybody, and now you can't shut me up.
Wow. So is this something that you've developed with practice? Years and
Yeah,
years
it really is.
talking?
Yeah, when see, there's one. uh, I edit my own stuff. You don't have to do that, but I do. And when you have to cut out, my other one is that's I'll be saying, well, and that's just your brain trying to figure out what you're going to say. So when I'm on this side of the mic, when I'm the interviewee, not the interviewer, I think I slow down a little bit because I really want to make sure I'm just not sounding like an idiot. And also, I want to save you. If you're the kind of person that's going to edit this and remove those, I feel bad because I'm making more work for you every time I go. And my God, I got to cut those out. So
No, we're gonna edit ours out, but we're gonna leave yours in.
leave mine in. Our goal is to make you sound like a complete moron. Yeah. So, but there is something to be said that when you do it enough, it just gets easier, and you pause before you think a little bit.
Yeah, even since our first episode, I mean, we're coming up around 20. We've seen a significant improvement in the amount of edits that I have to do has significantly decreased. And I like that because it's, it's less time. It's
You
less
still
time
whine
spent on
about it,
editing.
though.
I still whine because, I still have to listen to the whole episode.
Well, if you think about anything, tying your shoes, shooting a basketball, whatever, making spaghetti, it's hard to mess up making spaghetti, but I mean, the first, the first basketball, the first tying of the shoes, it's horrible, but you get better at the more you do it. And podcasting's no different. I think if you don't cringe when you listen to your first podcast, you waited too long.
Yeah, it was definitely cringeworthy. The first couple.
Yes. Yeah.
In fact, our second episode was so bad, we decided not to release it. And
beautiful. I say this to people all the time. It's not radio. It's not live. So if you record something and you go, yeah, that wasn't very good, there's no rule that says, well, I recorded it, I got to put it out for the world to see. No, you just delete it. I remember once I decided to wing it. I knew I had all the bullet points in my head. There's no reason to write this down. I'm just going to hit the microphone, and I just had tangent. My brain was going all over the place. So finally, after the third time or fourth time of recording it, I'm like, you know what? How about some bullet points? Some bullet points would come in really handy right now. And I just didn't release any of those until I got it right. And that's when I learned you need bullet points. So going back to practicing, that was one where I was like, I think I should be able to do this because I can see the bullet points in my head. But when I start to engage my mouth, I'm just all over the place.
Yeah, for that episode I was talking about, we did not have nearly enough bullet points, and we really enjoyed listening to it, but we just sounded so stupid that we decided it wasn't a good representation of how intelligent or knowledge we actually are, because we just sounded like idiots. But
it sounded the way we legitimately talk to each other. The conversation, we do a lot of circles when we talk to each other, and it was so painful to listen to because we touched on the same points. Like we were preaching to each other because we were preaching to the choir, and it just took an hour and a half to talk about 5 subjects, 5 or 6,
more or less, yeah.
And we touched each one about 20 times.
Ironically, we said something in that episode that we liked so much that's where our podcast name came from.
There you go. Little practice, little polish here and there, and that will happen. There are times when you'll have some sort of bizarre catchphrase is birthed because you tripped over your tongue or whatever. So yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking back to what you said about how your listeners feel like you're talking to them.
Yeah.
A while back, I was listening to one podcast with the same guy over and over again, and I listened to countless hours, and it was really weird because I felt like I genuinely knew him, and I've never met the guy. I'm never going to meet the guy, but I felt like we were friends.
Yeah, wait till you meet somebody. I have a guy like that. I've been listening to him since 2004. He is like OG podcaster, and his name is Dan Class. He does a show called The Bitterest Pill, and he's a stay-at-home dad. He says failed actor, part-time comedian, blah, blah, blah. And he's just talking about his life and raising his 2 kids while his wife goes to work. And I've listened to his kids grow up. I've listened to all of them, and I actually got to meet him. And the whole time I was just like, "Oh my gosh, you're Dan Class!" And he's like, "Oh yeah." It's weird because you kind of then you're like, "Remember the time when your daughter was 2 and she pooped on the floor?" And he's like, "Actually, she's in junior high right now, and I don't remember what I had for breakfast, and you're creeping me out." So it's kind of that weird scenario. But we're actually friends now. But I remember the first time I met him, it was this really weird dynamic because again, I feel like I know him and he's meeting me for the first time, and I've got 10 years of experience listening to his stories. It's a weird dynamic, and I now on occasion will have that flip where somebody will come up to me. I had somebody that came through. I'm out of Akron, Ohio, and he said, "Hey, I'm in Akron, you want to can we meet?" And I'm like, "Yeah, let's go to dinner." So we did, and he literally brought up something I said like 10 years ago, and he said, "Yeah, I use this to start off all of my classes I'm now teaching in school." And I'm like, "Wow, that's awesome. I didn't think anything of it when I said it," but you never know how you're impacting people. It's just, I started off in the basement next to the water heater, and it's just me and a microphone. And then you find out later that, holy cow, that actually meant something to somebody. So it's kind of cool.
That's funny. It's like a little weird, a little flattering.
Yeah.
But mostly weird. Most of, or I guess a good percentage of our listeners know us really well.
Mhm.
So we don't get any of that yet. Although we do have emails from totally random people that it seems like it's kind of the same thing. Almost, it's like
Yeah.
they know us, and we have no
Yeah.
idea who they are. They won't even give us their real name.
Well, and well, another thing you might look into is see if there are other podcasts similar to yours and see if you would want to invite them on to talk about a subject, and don't do it in a way like, "Hey, let's do an interview swap," because they don't really know you. So if you find a show you like and can legitimately say, "Hey, I like your show. I loved your take on this particular video game. Would you like to come over and share that with our audience?" And just have a good time, treat them great, make sure, they're having a good time. And then when you're done, say, "Hey, thanks so much." And again, this might be considered your competition, but maybe not. And if they had a good time, a lot of times they might say, but not always, but they might say, "Hey, why don't you guys come on our show?" Because they have what everybody wants. And that is people that already know what a podcast is and how to listen to it. So that's another thing you can do to kind of grow your audience. Reach out to other people in your kind of genre and see if you want to do an interview swap or a round table or anything like that.
Right, and I guess in the same regard, it's not exactly competition because the only
Right.
limiting factor on whether or not somebody will listen to your podcast is their time. So if they have time, maybe they'll just start listening to both podcasts. And
Yeah.
we're trying to do that. We're trying to reach out to people that have similar podcasts, but unfortunately, it's just kind of hard to find similar podcasts. I know that
Yeah.
there's just so many of them, but when I was searching for podcasts a week or so ago, I was running into probably a bunch of Anchor podcasts, but they were almost all dead. Like they
Mhm.
hadn't posted a new episode in 2 or 3 years. And
Yeah, that's it. And what's weird is there were times when the super early adopters were at the top of the charts because when they were on, it's kind of like this guy's before my time, so he's way before your time. But there was a guy named Milton Berle. They used to call him Mr. TV or Mr. Television or something like that. And he was like the number one show back in like whatever the late 50s. And if you watch him, he's really not funny. I go, the guy was up against a test pattern. That's why he was Mr. Television. He wasn't that funny. He was, he's up against, I don't know, Static. I think I could beat Static. And so there were early podcasts that got boatloads of downloads, which is one of the things that affects how you are in the charts. And so there would be people who had been podcasting for years and they're getting beaten by a podcast that hasn't had any episodes in years, but when they were actually live and publishing episodes, they had a huge number of listeners. So that's kind of frustrating. But all in all, the Apple charts, I actually work for a hosting company called Libsyn, which is short for Liberated Syndication. And Libsyn actually had a podcast, not like in New and Noteworthy or not in the What's Hot. They were on the front page of iTunes. Like you open up the iTunes software, there it was. The show was called Thanks Podcasting. And it was in November. It was all about, all these different stories of things that had happened to people because they had a podcast. And we're like, wow, front page of iTunes, this is it. Here come the downloads. And after a couple of weeks, it was a couple hundred downloads. So the charts thing, I always tell people, don't focus on the charts, focus on your audience. And if you focus on your audience and create good content, then you'll end up going up the charts. But if you just look at the charts, that doesn't do anything for you besides start to hate people that are at the top of the charts and be resentful, all the other fun things. So
Right. You got to focus on yourself, not
yeah.
not the other people. And it's
Yep.
hard. It's hard to do. I mean, it's hard to get the right perspective on things.
Yeah, there's a great book called You Can't Make This Stuff Up by Kevin Hart. And that dude's attitude is insane because so many times he would get a break. And it's like, all right, like the one, he actually got a TV show and he flew the whole cast to this thing. They're getting ready to do this big announcement and have all the cast walk out. And he's finally got his own show and he bought his mom a fur coat and all this other stuff. And literally they're 2 minutes from walking on stage with a cast and his manager contacts him and goes, the show's been canceled. He's like, what? We didn't go on the air yet. Yeah, they're not going to do it. And he's like, oh, you got to be kidding me. And I mean, stuff like that happened to him over and over and over. And his attitude was, you know what? Fine. I'm going to go back and I'm going to be so funny. You can't ignore me. It's just going to be impossible to ignore me. And the book is super inspiring and it's funny because it's Kevin Hart and he talks about all sorts of bizarre things. But it's a great book. And that's kind of been my attitude. If anytime something doesn't go my way, I'm like, okay, let's go back. Who's my audience? What do they want to hear? How can I do this in an entertaining way? Because what I did was I looked at whatever I consume, whether it's The Daily Show or Game of Thrones or whatever it is I'm watching on TV or on radio or whatever I'm listening to on Spotify. And it's like, why did I just watch that? Why did I consume that media? And it was basically things for me, either make me laugh, cry, think, groan, educate, or entertain. That's it. And I always ask myself before I hit the microphone, okay, am I going to make them laugh, cry, think, groan, educate, or entertain? And preferably two. Like if I can make them laugh and educate them, or laugh and get them to think, or cry and, et cetera. If you can get their emotions in, now you've kind of stimulated more than just their brain. You're stimulating their emotions.
Did you say groan in there? Is that a goal?
Groan, as in like, there's a show I listen to. I won't say it, but I listen to him because it's just the person gives out horrible information. And I listen to it because I'm like, I can't believe that guy is going to say that again. And he'll say like, oh yeah, just do that. And I'm like, geez, that is, just get a blue Yeti and stick it in the middle of the table. Oh my God, I can't believe. So that guy, I am groaning. I'm just like, I can't believe this guy has an audience. So that's what I mean by that. And there are people that listen to Howard Stern. Why? Because they hate him and they just want to, or Rush Limbaugh. They just want to yell at the radio. So there are people that listen to you because you make them groan.
Interesting. I don't think that I could do that.
I could. That's a very easy thing for me to do.
It's fun. There are times when you just like, there's a great show. I love the host. She's awesome. It's called Congressional Dish. And Jen Briney, and she reads the bills that go through Congress. And you actually hear what your Congress is doing and how they're not doing very nice things and they're giving themselves pay raises. And it's just, you listen to it. And then when you turn on the news and it's like, insert Jenner Kardashian here wore a sheer dress at the awards last night. And you're like, so that's one that it's not groaning because I hate the host. I love the host. She's hilarious, by the way. Every time she says the F word, they put in a golf swing. So it's entertaining and it's funny, but it makes me want to punch somebody. So that's another one that it's making me emotional in one way or another. It's making me laugh, but it's also making me want to find my congressman and just ever so politely punch him in the face.
Yeah, you don't. Well, me at least, I don't really want to know how that sausage is made. It's just so much.
You don't.
So much stuff going on.
Yeah, there are times when I don't listen because I'm having a great day and it's fun and the sun is out and I'm like, you know what? I'm going to listen to that show when it's raining or something next week.
Right. I'm definitely going to have to go back through this podcast and listen or write down everything that you mentioned. Cause you mentioned, I don't know, 10 different podcasts and 5 or 6 different books.
Yeah. It's kind of my biggest hobby. Like I'm getting ready when we get done here, I'm going to hop on a 10-speed bike and go hit some bike trails, but I'm always reverse engineering. It's kind of annoying at times, but if I read a book, if I like it, I go, okay, why did I like that? What was it making me do? Or why did I'm always anything that's like, wow, that was really good. I'm like, okay, good. Let's enjoy the fact that it was good, but like, why was it good? And then I'll kind of pick it apart. Ooh, this was cool and this and that. So I'm always kind of trying to figure out how to make good content. Because in the end, that's really what we're all doing, whether we're on YouTube or a podcast or a newsletter or whatever. It's all content. And so it's a matter of how can I make content that's going to grab people by the neck and make them wanting more.
So do you do a lot of off-road biking?
I do now because I live in Ohio and it's like snowy about 5 months out of the year.
Right.
But there's a thing in Ohio. It used to be the Ohio Erie Canal, and so the path that the donkeys used to walk on to pull this canal boat is now flattened, and it's paved and everything like that. So you just get the bike out. It's a bike trail, and what's beautiful is you're going through the woods and there's no cars and things like that. The only thing you have to watch out for is kids that don't know their left from right, because you'll say, hey, I'm passing on the left. And you'll hear the parent go, Johnny, get over to the right. And Johnny swerves right to the left and goes right into your tire. And you're like, okay, somebody needs to teach Johnny left from right. That's not going to work.
Yeah, definitely.
So you don't ride your bike on the road very often, though?
Where I live, it's not, unless I want to die. I live on a 4-lane kind of almost highway. And I kind of miss the days. So I grew up in a neighborhood that I could just ride all over the place. And it's not so much, I used to have a kind of a mountain bike. This is more of I don't know what you would call it, a trail. Well, not even trail, because that sounds off-roading as well. But this is more like it's not Pee Wee Herman, but it's definitely a 10 speed.
I just bring it up because my father-in-law actually has recently started a podcast that primarily focuses on off-road riding. It's called Mid-Atlantic Gravel, Travel, and Dirt. And yes, that is a mouthful. But he's got a lot of good information, and they're pretty hilarious. If you're interested, I'm sure that he would appreciate you checking it out and maybe giving him some tips.
Yeah, I would definitely check that out. He'd probably be giving me tips. I just it's funny. I get fat in the winter and then I hop on the bike and lose it over the summer. So that's the plan, at least.
That's the cycle.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. Okay. I think any instant success tips for us before we hop off?
Instant success.
Yeah,
I don't know.
We should quit our day jobs and then.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And I think we'll make it big in another 2 weeks here. So.
Yeah. Save your money when you get some. Yeah. No, just have fun with it. I one of the biggest things you can do that will just suck the life out of you is if you compare your show to other shows. I have clients to be like, oh my gosh, I've got 110 people downloaded my last episode. And so when I hear that, let's say it's 120, just because it's easy math. My background's in teaching, that's 6 classrooms. That's 6 classrooms of people that when you have DVDs and Xbox and Hulu and Netflix and all the other things, these are people that are choosing to listen to you. There is no spam in podcasting. And you've got 6 classrooms. That would be a hallway at my old job of people that have tuned into you. And then they'll go into some forum somewhere, Facebook or whatever, Reddit. And somebody's like, hey, I just went over 400,000 downloads an episode. And it just sucks the life out of them. And I'm like, don't do that. Don't look at other people's stuff. And also realize that person might have a team of 19. That person may not have 2 jobs and a spouse and a kid. There's all sorts of other things about that. And you are having fun talking to 120 people. It's still fun to talk to 120 people. Go get in a room with 120 people. That's a lot of people. But I see it time and time again where people are like, oh, because it's like, well, they must be better than I am. No, they've probably been doing it longer than you have, or for whatever. Or a lot of times it's they came from some place where they already had an audience, Joe Rogan and all these other people. Well, the guy was on Fear Factor forever and he had all the WFC stuff. I mean, it's not like he came into this with no audience. He had a huge audience. So be careful comparing yourself to others, and instead just focus on your audience, have fun with them, and make the best content you can, and then go out and promote it.
We really appreciate you taking the time out of your day for this, for us.
Yeah, I know we've gone a little bit past what you had blocked off, but a lot of great information, a lot of great insight. And we're definitely gonna take this stuff to heart. So thank you so much again for being on. We really, really appreciate it.
Oh yeah, let me know when this goes out. I'll be happy to promote it.
Okay, that would be awesome. And if you have any guests that you think might be interested in coming on our podcast, that would be awesome as well.
Yeah, awesome. Sounds good. We'll see you.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed, don't forget to subscribe and check out our social media channels, our Patreon, and our Teespring, which will be linked in the description. Thanks again for listening.